Okay, welcome to podcast. I think we're on 39. Another in a long year of podcasts. And we are moving from our unit on genetics, as understood and given to us by Mendel, into a place where genetics is also very important. It's a very nice bridge over to this idea of evolution by natural selection. I want you to understand how absolutely foundational this idea is to the science of biology. Biology, as biologists understand it, work with it, does not exist without this concept. It's the foundational underpinning of everything. It is extremely important. It, for some, is also very controversial, and for some even threatening. It is certainly not my intention to be either controversial or threatening with you, as I hope you would know. Nonetheless, as an educated person of the 21st century, this is an idea you fundamentally should understand, as we should understand all ideas before we either accept or believe them or don't believe them. It's to say you believe something or don't believe something without understanding it seems wrong. So let's understand this thing, and that's where we're coming from with this. You need to understand this idea of evolution. It's certainly an important idea in our world today. The name that is most associated with this idea of evolution by natural selection is, of course, Charles Darwin. We can see his final resting place in Westminster Abbey here in this photograph. His main work, though he wrote piles of stuff, but of course his main work that we associate with him is called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, in which he laid out his ideas about evolutionary change by natural selection. What he described in this book, the idea of evolution was not new with Charles Darwin. That had been thought of before many times. What was new with this man was that he actually explained how evolution might actually occur. Many people had said, "Oh, it appears that life must have changed over time because look at these fossils, look at this." But no one would say how that could happen. He gave us a mechanism, a means by which this kind of change could happen, and he called that mechanism natural selection. Okay, so evolution is the change in the kinds of species on Earth over time. Okay, that's it. Change in the kinds of species on Earth over time. We can see that that has happened. There are fossils that did not exist in the beginning, but the living things do exist now. We see them now. Their fossils were different earlier in the history of Earth than the living things are now. We can see that things have changed. But what he proposed was, again, this idea of natural selection, and he said that it was natural selection that led to this idea of evolutionary adaptation. Here is a definition. All these words kind of give me a headache, but there are some phrases here that we need to begin associating with this idea of natural selection. First of all, natural selection is the change in a population and some trait that a population has, the genes of the population, if you will, that code for that trait, whatever, but maybe how it looks, whatever. Change in a population, not one individual, not an individual. An individual cannot evolve. So if you are ever asked about the evolutionary significance of something, Do not talk about it in terms of an individual. You need to talk about it in terms of a population. One individual getting a new trait is not evolution. That's one individual getting a new trait. That's a mutation. What makes that an evolutionary change is if that new trait is so beneficial to an organism that it gets passed on to its children, and then its children pass it on to their children, and so on. So change in a population of organisms that occurs, again, this is going to take not just one individual arising with this trait, but generations, so that many individuals eventually would have the trait. The trait must be inheritable. Going out and getting a tattoo today is not going to make that trait. Your child's not going to get that. That's not inheritable, so that's not going to apply to natural selection. The trait has to be inheritable, okay? And the trait makes organisms better suited to their environment than other organisms. That's important, because if you have some trait that makes you better suited to your environment than someone else, then perhaps you can outcompete them for food, you can outcompete them for lots of things, and thus you get to leave more offspring behind. And then those offspring, because the trait was inheritable, they get it from you, and they're better suited, and they pass it on to their children, and so on. So these are some of the ideas you need to get about natural selection. Only populations evolve, not individuals. It takes generations to evolve, not just once. The traits that we are talking about must be inheritable from one generation to the next, and this is critical. The winners in evolution are the ones who leave more offspring. I don't care if you have the best traits in the world, but if you don't leave offspring behind, then they don't count, at least in terms of making evolutionary change. Okay? Reproductive success is a really good phrase for you to remember. More offspring means reproductive success. That is really important in the concept of evolution by natural selection. Make sure we know what the term adaptation means, and evolutionary adaptation, and inherited. There's that phrase again, characteristic that enhances an organism's ability to survive. Yes, survival's good, but reproduction is critical in some environment. So maybe this characteristic enhances this guy's ability to survive and reproduce in his environment. Maybe it allows him to attract more females, and so he gets to pass his genes on to more offspring than a lizard that does not have that colorful, lovely, bizarre thing coming out of his throat. Okay, so processes that have transformed life from its original earliest form to that of all the life forms we have around today. Basically, we've already mentioned this, change in the kinds of species that exist on Earth over time. We do need to realize that this is a genetic component. We can talk about evolution not only as a change in physical appearance in an offspring, and generation after generation after generation, but also a change in the genes they possess. So we will talk about that quite a bit. The genes are important in talking about evolution. All right, now Darwin is who we credit with this idea of natural selection, but he didn't just pop up with this out of nowhere. He was building on ideas of others, whether they knew it or not. He was certainly not the first person to suggest evolution. The Greeks had done this before him, but they, again, no one ever gave a decent explanation about how it could occur. Now, certainly the view in Darwin's time, evolutionary ideas were not what was popular. What was popular was the idea that the Earth was but a few thousand years old, as determined by going back from one generation backwards to the next in the Bible and calculating that. I believe the biblical understandings had the Earth at about 6,000 years old, and that the Earth was populated by life forms all at once during this single week of creation, and those forms did not change. They were fixed, immutable forms, life forms. So all put here at the same time, 6,000 years ago, and they hadn't changed since they were put here. Unchanging forms. Okay, all put here at once. Now, well before Darwin, there were some scientists that laid work that later on Darwin would begin to draw from. It would shape his thinking, even unconsciously. This man, very important, Carolus Linnaeus, much earlier than Darwin, I believe 1700s, maybe into the 1600s somewhat, I'm not sure, but the father of taxonomy, meaning how do we name living things, how do we organize living things into some kind of meaningful categorical organization. Life on Earth is just overwhelming. How can we talk about this and organize it? And that's what Linnaeus did for us. He gave us the binomial system of naming organisms. You are a member of the group, the species Homo sapiens, and it was Linnaeus who gave us this means of naming organisms, and this idea of grouping similar species into increasingly general categories. For example, I'm sure you remember kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, those levels of classification. He came up with that. Now, for him to group us with chimpanzees and other apes into kind of a family, if you will, and then link us with cats and dogs and elephants and as a group of mammals, and then to put us mammals together with birds and reptiles and so on into a group called vertebrates. That did not imply evolutionary relationships to Linnaeus. He believed that all life forms were put here at once and they were fixed. They were not branching off from each other in a relationship. Nonetheless, he did organize them in this hierarchical kind of way, and unbeknownst to him, Darwin would look at the groupings that he did and say, those seem like almost like those could be family groupings, like those could be related to each other in some way. And it did help lay the groundwork for Darwin's thinking, even though that certainly was not Linnaeus's intent so many years before. The study of fossils, the remains of organisms from the past, mostly found in sedimentary rock. Many of these fossils we find because they were aquatic or they fell into an aquatic situation and their remains floated down to the bottom and were laid in this muck on the bottom of a pond and then buried by more sediment and muck, and then we find their remains preserved as the rock is exposed millions of years later. Paleontology is the study of fossils, and this science was largely developed by Cuvier, as you can see, in the early 1800s, late 1700s. This idea of looking at fossils and seeing that life on Earth was indeed composed of different things earlier on in the fossil record than it is now is a pretty important concept in talking about evolution. Cuvier is the one who developed this science of paleontology. He started documenting fossil species in a place called the Paris Basin. This is a picture of his work. You can see he said that he noticed that these are all sedimentary rock layers, and he noticed that each stratum or layer in these rocks had unique fossil species in it. The life found in the preserved in the rocks here was different from that was preserved in the rocks up there. And he said that the further down you went into to the rock, the more different the fossils, the life forms you found were from what you found at the top. So he noticed that as you went from one layer to the next, life forms changed, and they got increasingly different the further away you got from the original layers. So that's a lot for one guy to put together. Here you can see, let me get rid of my marks here. Come on, Coleman, you can do it. Erase all ink on slide. This is a great example of sedimentary rock here, and if you go in and start chiseling out the layers, you often find fossils preserved. This rock was once at the bottom of a lake or an ocean, and geologic processes thrust it up now into what looks kind of like a desert type of situation, and we can see it. This is an excellent view. I think this is probably the Grand Canyon, but of the different geologic periods and where they are in the rocks of the canyon. Down low we have more ancient geologic period. Up higher we have more recent, though none of these is particularly recent to us, but at any rate, here's another great layer image of some sedimentary rock showing what it looks like and how you could chisel away and find fossils embedded in the layers inside. Fossils that often look like this. This is clearly marine life, a lot of mollusks in this fossil bed, but these fossil beds are often found in places like the desert, or I believe the Sahara Desert is a place where they've been finding whale remains and things like that, and so clearly the world was a very different place back in millions of years ago, with places once being covered in ocean that are no longer covered in ocean, and we can see the evidence for this in the fossils. Now, Cuvier was not an evolutionary biologist. He did not think of evolution. He didn't advocate it. It wasn't a factor in his life and his thinking. What he did advocate was an idea called catastrophism, which is not what we think of today, but he suggested his explanation for these different boundaries that we see in layers like this is that some catastrophe happened and wiped out all the organisms, and then new ones just kind of migrated in and took their place. That was his idea. So that basically everything we saw that happened was the result of some catastrophe. Every change in species was due to a catastrophe, hence the name of his idea. Now, Hutton is another geologist. These are geologists, paleontologists, people that were not biologists, but nonetheless really important for Darwin's thinking. This man said that the different landforms we see on the planet didn't have to arise from a catastrophe. Some enormous event didn't just have to pop a mountain up in a day. He said that the things that we see happening today can explain all of the features that we see on the earth around us, not epic catastrophes. For example, canyons are formed not by some epic catastrophe, but by the gradual wearing away of the rock by the perpetual running of the water through it. That these sedimentary rocks that we see were actually, made as sediment as the sea life fell to the bottom or was covered by sediment and pressed together, and we had the rock form embedding these things inside. So he said we could observe stuff like this happening today, and it could explain everything that we were seeing about our planet. Hutton also said something that was really important for Darwin, and that was that the Earth was way older than most believed it was at the time. He said that the Earth was many, many millions of years older. Now, he didn't have it at its age that we have it today, which is about 4.6 billion years old, but nonetheless, he had it at being much older than 6,000 years. That's critical, because without that amount of time to work with, evolutionary change by natural selection simply cannot occur. So that the Earth is actually much older than 6,000 years gives Darwin's ideas the time they need in order to happen. So Hutton's idea then was gradualism. Okay, his idea was that the profound changes in the Earth that we see now, we're talking about rocks, not living things, but that these changes are the result of not big catastrophes, but slow, continuous processes that occur over a really long time, because the Earth really is quite old, and it's enough time for these very slow processes to have enormous impacts. Okay? And so this is the direct contrast with catastrophism. So what Cuvier gave us was paleontology, was finding fossils and seeing that they differ in rock strata. But what Hutton gave us is this idea that the Earth is really old, and that processes that shape the Earth today have always been shaping the Earth. And it's not big catastrophes. Now, of course, there sometimes are big catastrophes, but it's just not always big catastrophes that are creating these features that we see. They're slow, observable processes that over millions of years make a huge difference. Now, this man, Lyell, was the leading geologist when Darwin was living, and he took Hutton's ideas and created this idea of something called uniformitarianism. And basically, he formalized what Hutton said and said that the geological processes that are occurring today have always occurred, and they have not changed. Nothing much different is happening today than what happened very early in Earth's history. The forces that build mountains today are the same forces that built mountains millions of years ago. The same forces that erode them today are the same forces that eroded them millions of years ago. Charles Darwin was really influenced by these ideas, and especially this idea of the Earth being really, really old, and that slow, subtle processes can have huge, huge effects. Okay? And he got to thinking, well, if these ideas can be true for rocks, couldn't they maybe be true for living things as well? Though certainly this was not in the front burner of his mind, but certainly somewhere in the back as he started to put things together. All right, you probably ought to know who Lamarck is. He lived mostly before Darwin's time, and he was really the first one to give a credible shot at suggesting about how evolution might occur, about trying to give us a means by which it could happen. Unfortunately for him, he got it wrong, and it is only for getting it wrong that most people remember him. But really, he got it more right than people give him credit for. He published his ideas, right around when Darwin was born. His idea of how evolution occurred basically was built from two ideas: the idea of use and disuse of a body part. You either use it or you don't. You build it up or it kind of withers away. And the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Okay? Both of these ideas are wrong, and you need to be very, very careful, because it is very easy to slip when you are talking about Darwin's idea of natural selection, it is really easy to slip into Lamarckian phrasing. Be careful not to do that, okay? Use and disuse. This idea said that the parts of the body that are used a lot become larger, they become stronger, whatever. For example, the classic Lamarckian example is that a giraffe would stretch its neck to reach flowers at the top of a tree, and it would pass on its slightly stretched neck to its offspring, who would be born with a slightly longer neck, and then they would stretch their neck and then pass that on, and so on. So that idea is the inheritance of acquired characteristics. So basically this says that modifications an organism acquires. I go out tomorrow and get my big tattoo. I'm going to put a big heart on my shoulder, and I'm going to then be able to pass that on to my offspring. No, we do not pass on things that we acquire in our lifetime. But he did get right that parents are passing on something to their offspring, and that if it's useful, it's going to be passed on and help that offspring. Okay? So, though it seems silly to us today, Lamarck was really better than we give him credit for. He did say that evolutionary change was what best explained the fossil record and the changes over time we see in that fossil record. He also recognized that the Earth must be very, very old. And he did emphasize adaptation to the environment as being kind of the product of evolution. A giraffe gets a long neck. It's an adaptation to its environment. It helps it reach the tall leaves on the trees. He just didn't get it quite right about how that happens. So this brings us to who we should have been talking about all along, right? Coleman, why are you boring me with all this stuff? Because it's important.